Okay, so welcome. I'm Coach Art with egelloC. I'm doing my training for this evening. And first of all, I just want to thank you for joining me. I'm always so appreciative when you join me for my trainings because I know that you could be spending time with your family and friends or doing some interesting things that you have in your life, but you choose to spend it with me. So I'm so always grateful for you joining these trainings. And I truly hope that you get a lot out of the trainings because I look forward to providing, useful information for all of our families and all those who are joining us that are not part of our program as well. So tonight we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic, which is test optional, okay? And specifically test optional meaning the SAT, ACT, okay? There was a transition over to this during the COVID times. I'll go into that. But so talking about, really building your test optional strategy, what it's all about or so, okay? So what I'd like for you to do is, again, I'm a reaction guy, and so I always say, if you ever see anything in which you think what I've said was interesting, that you liked, then please go ahead and give me a heart reaction. Let's try that right now. And I'd love to see the heart reaction, just so I can see that you guys. There you go. I love it. And the reason why, because that gives me an indication of what are the things that I'm saying that really, resound well for you. Okay. So that helps me in future types of trainings to be able to form fit that to the audience. Okay. So again, we'll go ahead and get started here. We're building your test optional strategy. So what are we going to talk about today? What we're going to do is first, we're going to look at how to tell if your scores actually help or possibly even quietly hurt your application. Okay. Then we will demystify what test optional is, and even test required, and what it really means and what it doesn't mean. Okay. And then finally, I'm going to walk you through some strategies to make your application even stronger if you choose not to submit scores or if you choose to submit scores. Okay. So that can be from both ways. So let's talk about what test optional actually really means, because there's so many terms out there that you will see that has been out in the kind of the, I guess, in the landscape since this has really become a big, a big thing, and really that happened, during the COVID time, right? So first of all, let's clear up some confusing terms. I've heard test optional, test blind, test flexible. Okay, so what do these all mean? First of all, and you can see that here. So first of all, test optional really means that the school will review your application with or without test scores. Okay, again, thus the term optional. If you submit the scores, they will be considered. If you don't, you're not going to be penalized for that, at least in theory. Okay, at least in theory. And then there's another they say test blind. Okay, so that means they won't even look at your scores. Even if you submit them, and they will not look at them. So one prime example are the UCs, the University of California schools. They are a prime example because they literally in the application it says do not post your tests scores on here. We do not want to see them. Okay, so that's test blind. And then lastly, there's a term they say like test flexible, which means some schools might offer or might accept other standardized tests. For example, like APs or IB type of course scores instead of SAT, ACT. And that's a little bit more rare. But again, you have these terms. But, here's the catch. Just because a school is test optional, it doesn't mean that they don't prefer test scores. Okay. So many of the colleges out there still expect scores. And especially because if they're trying to determine merit aid, if they're trying to select between competitive majors and students, or even out of state applicants. Okay, so that's where we talk about, and I'll be talking about later about the unspoken rules that come in with respect to test optional. Okay, so if we take a look at, what does optional actually mean? Okay. We can kind of talk about the different things here. So first of all, um, we want to clarify that, the misconception optional doesn't mean that you won't be considered. Okay. And that's true. It really means is that And so you don't want to say is, oh gosh, I didn't turn my test in, so I'm not going to be seen. That's not true at all. Okay. Now, there is a fact that the scores that are submitted, they will be weighed heavily. Now, when I say weigh heavily, that might be too much of a stronger term, but they will be considered definitely because there's a lot of ways, and then we'll talk about the strategies that the scores can benefit you if you do submit them versus other candidates that don't. Okay. Because really, this is the hidden truth that some colleges are test preferred. Okay. Meaning that they prefer that you do submit it, but it's still optional. Okay. But that unfortunately is transparent. So it's not, I'm sorry, it's not transparent out there. And a lot of times you don't know if this colleges are test preferred. Okay. So that's what, again, test optional actually means. Okay. When we talk about it. Okay. So what happened? Why did the colleges go to test optional? Well, first of all, something happened. You all know about it about 4 or 5 years ago. A fairly significant event happened, which is COVID. Okay. And COVID really made access to testing unpredictable, unfortunately. Too many students couldn't get to the testing centers that were closed down. They were closing down the actual availability of sites. So many schools paused the score requirements because students, frankly, just couldn't take the test. Okay. Secondarily, going to test optional has really boosted the application numbers. I always say this in the UCs pre-COVID, there was about 60,000 applicants. Okay. And then just recently, which was last year, 207,000 applicants. So you see the boost, the increase of application numbers just skyrocketed dramatically because there was no longer that barrier of, oh, I have to make a certain score, right? Which this really helps schools look more selective in the rankings just because they have, just a bigger pool. And then lastly, finally, it aligns with their equity goals, meaning this especially helped the students that were under-resourced backgrounds or test-averse learners. Those that complained and said that maybe the tests were, biased or so. So this really allowed and freed that up and kind of met the goals, the equity goals that these schools had. But basically, what can we derive from that is that test optional isn't always about changing how they admit students. It's also about how they market themselves, right? And so that because it's so open now, that they are able to accept much more, so they're able to market themselves out there. Okay. Now, of course, you all know test required. This is what it used to be, right? A lot of the schools, major percentage of the schools before, prior to COVID, really were test required, and that's how they use it as a system to select students. But what are we talking about when we say test required? So test required policy really means that a college or university requires all applicants to submit a standardized test score. Okay, it makes sense, right? So typically the SAT or the ACT, which are the two main types of tests, and this is included as part of the admissions process. Now, these scores are mandatory, okay, for those who are test required, and your application will be considered incomplete without them, meaning that they will not go any further in reviewing your application until you show evidence and submit your test scores. Now, what are the key elements with respect to tests required? First of all, as I mentioned, it's mandatory. You got to submit your SAT, ACT scores to be considered. It applies to all applicants. There are no considerations for in-state, out-of-state, international. The only exception is for transfer students or those students that have test subject alternatives. Okay. Now, there's also it's used within the holistic review because everybody understands that throughout the United States, most of the majority of the schools out there are using what's called a holistic review. Okay, they're no longer just accepting students based on GPA and SAT or ACT scores like the UCs used to, like in 2012. Okay, so test scores are still required part of the academic review, even if the holistic review is used. Okay. There are no exceptions, okay? There's no way to opt out of submitting scores. And lastly, many of the schools, if they are test required, they tie the merit aid, the honors, the college admissions, and placement decisions to those submitted scores as well. So, if it is a test required score, you want to test required school, you want to take it very seriously. So, what are some of those schools? So you can see here, test required schools. Again, this is not a absolute definitive list of all of them, but here are some pretty well known: Harvard University, Yale, Brown, Dartmouth, UPenn, Cornell, which is going to be starting in 2026 fall, MIT, Caltech, Stanford as well, Georgetown. There are some private institutions here that you can see, which you probably may have never heard of. But one of them is John Hopkins, okay, requiring scores starting in the fall of 2026, okay. Other ones, you can see a lot here in the various states. Florida is a big one. Majority of the Florida schools are test required, and you could see some big names there: University of Florida, Miami, Georgia, Georgia Tech, University of Georgia. In Tennessee, you have University of Memphis, okay, University of Tennessee in Knoxville and Chattanooga. And in Texas, University of Texas at Austin, Texas A&M, TCU, and University of Dallas. Okay, so those are our bigger names with respect to those who are test required. And then you also have some other ones. Purdue, okay, a very popular school with respect to engineering. Louisiana Tech, okay, Auburn. Let's see here, West Virginia, and then of course the military academies, the U.S. Air Force, Naval, Army, all of the academies are definitely test required. Okay. So, what are the key insights with respect to tests required? Well, first of all, the test scores are used as gatekeepers, okay? The scores are often used in the initial review to filter out candidates and applicants, okay? Even though there is a holistic review, there it still does have some weight from that perspective. So, falling below a school's middle 50% range can definitely and significantly reduce your odds, even if you have a strong GPA. Because if they do a test, if they're a test required, again, they are looking at the SAT scores. If you are below middle 50%, okay, middle 50% of the range that they advertise, it's going to be difficult to get in. Now, scores are also compared within context. So, admissions officers will evaluate scores in the context of the high school, the curriculum rigor, and access to preparation. So, for example, 1350 SAT from a Title I high school may carry more weight than a 1450 from an elite prep school because, again, they're looking at the resources that are available for that student. Okay, and so still the holistic review, as I mentioned, is still part of it. High scores can strengthen the academic index. Okay, so at highly selective schools, test scores feed into their academic interest, which is a metric used to compare applicants very quickly with respect to their academics. But remember, we've always mentioned academics, activities, application. Academics is the least important, but it doesn't mean it's not important, right? So a strong score, it can really balance out a slightly lower GPA, particularly for athletes or those from underrepresented schools. So a stronger SAT, ACT can definitely offset a lower grades. Okay. AP and IB scores may complement, but they do not replace the ACT and the SAT. Okay, so at test required schools, AP or even IB are additive, they're not substitutes. Okay, so meaning additive is that it can add to, having you become more successful in getting accepted. And really, because the AP scores, they show subject mastery and it can really enhance the academic rigor, but again, it won't replace the SAT or the ACT requirements. And lastly, score reporting policies vary. So really, again, there's across the board with all these schools. Some schools they practice super scoring, which means it's combining the best scores from different dates, while others don't. Some require official score reports, by a certain deadline. Others accept self-reporting of those scores first, right? So there's a lot of variability in here, but these are kind of the key insights with respect to test required. Okay, test required. So if we're taking a look at test required strategies, a couple of things you should consider. And I know this is about test optional, but I did want to make sure that I didn't leave out test required. First of all, you want to plan early for testing and retakes. So if you're taking your first SAT or ACT, you should be no later by the spring of your junior year. That you take those. You can allow for even sooner than that or earlier than that, even the summer before your junior year or the beginning of your junior year, which really allows you time to retake, right? So and really again, you want to use the official practice tests to simulate conditions and really identify weak areas early on. Okay. Also, you want to make sure that you prioritize score range research. So what I mean by that is you want to make sure that you are looking and researching the schools and finding out what is their range, okay, and making sure that your range is within the, again, if it's the middle 50% or higher, you want to apply to schools where your score is at least in the top half of that range. Now, ideally, you want to be above the 75th percentile to really have a competitive edge within the range. Okay. So that's really, really important that you prioritize researching your score range, especially for those who are test required. Use your score strategically. So if your score is well above a school's average, highlight it prominently in your application. If your score is just slightly below, then again, how you offset that is doing really well in your essays, your recommendations, of course, your activities, right? Your extracurricular activities to really add depth. What you want to do as well, and this is what we always say, with course rigor, you want to pair your scores with the course rigor. So if you have a high SAT, ACT score, along with strong grades in rigor courses like AP, IB classes, that is, a secret sauce right there. That's the great combination because then it really does support one another that you are a strong academic student. Okay. Because if you have high scores, but the problem is if you have high scores, and high grades, but your rigor is low, that may raise concerns that you're coasting, meaning that you're getting good grades in the regular classes, but still you're not taking on the difficulty of college level classes. Okay. One thing is don't rely solely based on the scores. Even if it's a test required school, the admissions still remain holistic. So it is still what we always preach. The your academics, of course, you have to do well, but particularly your extracurricular activities, your leadership, your essays, your recommendations, all of these are differentiators. Okay, so that is huge, and you want to make sure that your essays, of course, show depth, which all of you have seen my trainings on that. Okay. Prep smart, not just hard. So what we mean is that, take advantage of all the free tools that are out there, Khan Academy, the ACT Academy, time mock exams, analytics to, prep for your efficiently. You know, think about a targeted prep course or a tutor. We offer also SAT prep courses, right? Cohorts, if you're part of our program. And then lastly, make sure that you confirm the policy nuances. So you want to make sure that you go to that school and you check, and double check the school's policies on their, SAT, ACT requirements. Okay. Are the scores required for scholarships, honors programs, or specific majors? Okay. Because some schools, like for example, UT Austin, they may require additional scores for placement or merit aid. Okay. So, let's talk about the effective scores when we're talking about test optional, okay? When we say test optional, so when the school is saying that you can submit or not submit, what happens there? So when is it that the scores, when they help you, when you actually are submitting your scores, how does that help? Well, here is the most important principle, and I know I've said this so many times. Submit your scores if you are at or above the school's middle 50% range. Okay. So you can use different data points. For example, like CDS data or websites, the common data set, big future or niche, okay, which actually they normally post, okay, these types of the ranges, okay? So if we take a look at those ranges, for example, USC's middle 50% SAT is 1440 and 15 between 1440 to 1540. So you want to submit your score if you're 1450 or higher, because again, that's in the middle, right? I'm sorry, the upper middle, okay? University of Oregon's middle 50% SAT, 1170 between 1170 and 1370. So submit it if you have 1250 or higher, okay? Another thing is AP scores can also help. So it's good if always we talk about privates for private schools, fours and fives in the core or intended major subjects can really help, okay? But the key thing here is if you want to be, again, as I mentioned, in or above the middle 50%, ideally 75% percentile. Okay, so that is really, really key. So you can use that as a gauge. All right. And I see some hearts, so thank you so much. I know it's good to always have numbers, right? Okay. So when does the scores hurt you? Okay. Well, what if your scores fall below the middle 50% range? Okay, that's when they actually do hurt you for submission. Okay, so submitting, a 1200 to a school where most students submit 1400 or higher, that may raise questions. Okay, now the key thing here is they won't reject you just for that, but the unfortunate thing is it becomes a weak point that they can weigh you against other students. Now, again, the academics, the activities, the essays, those have higher merit. But because things are so competitive now, the factors of, let's say, these SAT scores and ACT scores could make a difference because it's so narrow with respect to all the students and comparing you against other students. So this goes along the same lines of same for APs. If you get a 2 or a 3, let's say in AP Calculus, it's probably best not to report it because you're allowed to pick which scores to send. So you make sure you want to do that. Coach Tony has always said, because he was at the UCs as a reader, he said, report all the scores, right? But non-UCs, you want to only do the fours and the fives, okay? Fours and the fives. Um, and you can see here, so-so scores distract from strengths in grades, essays, or rigor. So that's the reason why you just don't want to bring that entrance into the brain of the reader, okay? Now, when we talked about holistic review, okay, holistic review without test scores. So this is the thing, if you don't submit the scores, then what do you do? Well, first of all, schools focus more. And again, I know we've talked about GPA, and I should have put a strike through this. It's really more about, and we say GPA, it's more about the grades and the course rigor, okay? Did you truly challenge yourself? And that's the important thing. Did you truly challenge yourself? Did you go above and beyond what was offered to you at the school and you took extra things, which would be, for example, rigor of classes, okay? Like honors classes, AP courses, dual enrollment or so. Okay, what did you do with respect to extracurriculars and leadership? And really, the key thing here, remember, we talked about is that extracurriculars, you want to have, if you're going UCs or CSUs, 20 to 25 plus hours or more per week. A top 20 is, 25 to 30 per week. Ivy Leagues is 30 to 35 plus hours more per week total. Okay. So that's really, really important, and that you show leadership and that you're showing growth, okay, and development. Another thing is your letters of recommendation, okay, and your essays, of course. Now, our letters of recommendations are so important because that really does convey, if the school asks for it, it really does convey another aspect of who you are, okay? It can be almost act as another essay because they give additional information about you. And then, of course, the essays. So important. I can't, the personal insight questions, your Common App essays. Very, 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 very key. Another thing is contextual data. So, what we talk about is your school profile, your family background. This is actually stated in the UCs, okay? The UC when they're talking about their acceptance criteria or their overlays, in which your family background can make a difference if, for example, contextually, let's say you had to help your family with taking care of the kids or so. These are contextual context data that really can help you. Okay. So, for example, score silent. Okay. So, some of these schools, at test optional schools, admissions officers often create what they call a score silent file, meaning they review you as if scores don't exist. And that makes every other piece of your application more important. Okay. So, again, remember, test optional, versus submitting and not submitting. If you don't, then they will look at you with respect to a score silent file. Okay. Now, what is the unspoken rule of test optional? Well, here's what many families don't realize. Test optional policies are not always as optional as they sound because so you got to figure this out. So, for example, a highly selective school, let's say like Georgetown or MIT, they say they're test optional, but people who are almost all of the admits submit scores. And I know that's like disheartening for some people, like, oh my gosh, well, how do I know? But again, it's one of those things where, as I mentioned, that scores can make a difference. Large public institutions like UT Austin or University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, which is again my alma mater, even test optional scores are used for merit aid and major placement. And so that's another consideration when we're talking about the unspoken rule of test optional. Okay. Some majors like engineering and business still expect scores even if they're optional. And the reason why is because these are highly impacted majors. And so what they're doing is they're trying to take as many criteria as they can to assess the students. And one of those things are if you have a strong SAT, ACT, that's good, okay? And so often, strong math scores, even unofficially, again, can really turn the tide, if you have it, right? So when we take a look at test scores, they can affect scholarships, honors college eligibility, even when, they're not required for admissions. So you want to make sure you check the school's fine print, okay? And if you take a look at, there are some hidden pressures, institutional priorities, for example, like rankings, yield protection. So when we're talking about yield protection, they're talking about, which students are really, if they accept them, which students are really going to actually accept the acceptance, okay? And so the students that are high with respect to the test scores, they more have usually have an inclination of that, okay? All right. So, what are some strategies if you don't submit? Okay, what are some strategies if you don't submit? So, first of all, um, academically, okay, of course, as I mentioned, and we kind of went through this, you want to emphasize your rigor, your APs, dual enrollment, or honors rigors in your transcripts. So you want to make sure again you're maximizing the amount of rigor courses you take. And I know I've kind of mentioned this before, but these are still again strategies that still hold tried and true, and that we always preach, right? Essays, this is I can't say it is probably the most important factor. Use them to show intellectual curiosity, writing strength, but also just to show who you are. Okay. Use them so that your writing becomes your voice and it really shows them who you are. Your activities, again, you can build this profile, this narrative that really shows involvement, especially in those things that you are passionate about, right? And I've talked about this, and if you haven't heard about this, being a spiky student versus a rounded student, really, really important. If you don't know what I mean, go and look at the archives in our YouTube channel. You'll see one about activities, and listen to my training about activities and what's important about activities. And then of course letters of rec. If the school is asking for it, ask the teachers who know you the best. know your learning style, know your strengths. Make sure that they really speak to that in their letters of recommendation, really. And then really thinking creatively. Um, Sometimes the schools allow you are able to submit additional materials, particularly if you are a creative individual. Let's say in the arts, they'll ask you for writing samples, or they might ask you for examples of your work. Okay, so that could be thinking creatively if they allow you to do that. Okay, so if they allow you to do that. Okay. Some tools for score for your scores. If you, for example, how to find the score ranges, and I mentioned this before, the common data set. So, if you Google the common data set, if you Google and you put the school name, so for example, Google Harvard Common Data Set, and then if you check section C9, okay, for the test scores, you will see the ranges and the particular scores that have been received for that year. So again, the college name and then type in common data set and you'll find it. Another thing is like say Big Future by the College Board. Okay, they give score ranges and test policy summaries. Another thing is fairtest.org. Okay, they list test optional colleges and all of their fine print. Okay, all of their fine print. Another thing you guys probably have heard this is Naviance or Score. A lot of the high schools use this. They have a lot of these amazing scattergrams of past students and their scores and outcomes. So it's great to see what those past scores are for those schools. Okay, so that's a great way to see where your score lies, and if you're above 50% or below. Okay. So if we take a look at some examples. So for example, student A, he has a 3.9 GPA. And again, remember, as I mentioned, we don't like to dwell on GPA too much, but just this is for purposes of you guys can see quick case studies. 3.9 GPA, 1270 SAT, okay? And he's applying to Boston University. Well, if the middle 50%, if you look at this, a range is 1340 to 1500. Well, definitely it's below the range. You do not want to submit to Boston University, although it is a test optional, so you don't want to submit your score there. Okay, so that's very important, even though you have a 3.9 GPA. Now, student B here has a 3.7 GPA, has a 1500 SAT, but is applying to UC Berkeley. Well, again, UC Berkeley is test blind, as we talked about. The UCs are test blind. So you don't want to submit it because it's going to be irrelevant because they are told, all the readers are told, they cannot consider 1500. Even if you put it in there, you will most likely make them mad because you're not following instructions. But if we talk about student C, 4.2 GPA, okay? They don't have any scores and they're applying to Wake Forest. Well, then how you're going to really, show that you should be a student there, you're going to use, as I mentioned, the essays, your transcript to showcase rigor, your extracurricular activities or so. Okay, so those are the different types of quick case studies when we're talking about when and when not to submit. Okay. All right. So, what are the key takeaways? What are the key takeaways that we would consider with respect to test optional? Okay. So, first of all, as I mentioned, research each school's middles 50% and test optional language. It's very, very important. Read the fine print. Okay, if you're above it, submit it. If you're below it, consider holding back. Okay, so that's just the kind of submit if you're solidly within the range, or within or above that range, right? Okay. Another thing is decide by school, not one, because remember, you got decide by school, not one size fits all. So you might submit to some of the schools and some you might not. Okay, depending upon the circumstances of that school. So you want to make sure that you again do your research with respect to your SAT scores and really find out, are you within that range and it doesn't make sense? Does it really improve your ability to be successful and being accepted? So again, if you're not submitting, craft a stronger file through essays. If you have a resume and you can submit it, great. And your course rigor if you don't submit. Another thing, and we talk about this, okay? Remember, you can consider taking the test again, okay, if your score is borderline. And I would recommend you do that. But remember, we always say is you don't want to necessarily take the tests or SAT or ACT more than twice. What you want to do is to make sure is that you are um, doing the best that you can the first time you take the test, and then secondarily, if you find that you don't have the score you want, then you take a secondary test. I can see a third test, depending upon the school that you're looking at, especially if you're going to Ivy Leagues. But we always say is don't play the numbers game, in which because typically students do not raise their scores more than 100 points. We say is after 3 or 4 intense studying weeks, they could raise their score about 100 points. The highest we always see it kind of averages about 200 points. But again, it really drops off after that. And as you get higher in the ranges, so for example, you have a lot of opportunity to go from a 1200 to a 1300, but going from 1400 to 1500, that makes it harder. It's just the numbers show that way, okay? So remember, I want to, after all of this, and after talking about this, there is no shame in going test optional, okay? There are many, 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 many students who get into schools without their scores. I literally saw a lot of students this year in our program, or 2025, that made it into private schools and they did not submit their score because their score wasn't, it didn't give them any advantage. But again, when in doubt, make your decision with data. Okay, that's the key thing. And as we always said, the middle 50% range, if you're above it, most likely if you're 75%, then you're very, very competitive. Okay, you're very, very competitive. So with that, if there's any questions before I say that, if you are not part of our program, and again, I always, we love what we do. You can see that we're very passionate about what we do. If you found this interesting and you want to talk to us about your student, you can always book a free 15-minute assessment with our college admissions counselors. And just go ahead and type in the word book, BOOK, to BOOK for, and then 949-775-0865. And we will have one of our admissions counselors give you a call and set up a call. Okay. Again, BOOK 949-775-0865. So with that said, I am going to now, first of all, did you find that information useful? If you could, please give me a heart. I'd love to see if that information. Okay, great. Whew. Okay. Oh, there are some times I've never had a training where I had no hearts. So that's a good thing. I'm glad that you guys saw that. Okay. So let's go ahead and I'm gonna go through questions. Look, like some people have questions here. Wow. Okay. Should we also report if AP score is 3, especially in the hard APs? Again, as I mentioned before, if you don't have so for private schools, fours and fives, not threes, okay? But for the UCs, report all the scores. Doesn't matter what score you got in the APs, report all the scores for UCs, okay? Another question is, so if you don't have a high SAT score for the school you're applying to, is it better to not submit than to submit, correct? Okay, so again, let's be specific. If you are 50% or higher in the range of the school, okay, and that's why you have to do a your research, then submit. If you're below that, then it doesn't do you well, or it won't really do you well if you submit your score, okay? Question is, I heard they also look for year-over-year improvement in grades. So while submitting grades, where and how do you submit year-on-year grade progress? Okay, so the question was is that they look for year-over-year. Absolutely, they look for year-over-year improvement. So what happens here is in your application, you are going to put, you're going to self-report your classes and your grades from freshman year to senior year. And that also includes because if you've taken, let's say, classes in community college, you're going to also put additional schools that you attended and then put those grades in there. So they definitely look at your grades and year to year over improvement. And remember, we always say is you want the grade trend to go upwards, right? From freshman year to sophomore year. A's and B's are good grades. More A's are better than B's. Okay. So you want that trend to be going up. You don't want it to be going up and then it kind of slopes down. Because typically, again, your junior and senior year, they're expecting that you're taking the hardest courses and hopefully you're getting the best grades because you've had 2 years under your belt. You know what the process is, you know what you've been doing, you're familiar with how school is. And on top of that, because you are more mature, then again, it's one of those things where you make sure that you can uh, provide and show a trend upwards. Okay, and you will see so the year over year improvement. They will see that self-reported on your application for freshman, sophomore, and junior year. And then when you get accepted, then of course you submit your final transcript. Okay, and then that final transcript, of course, will say. So that's the reason why we always say, first of all, don't lie and make sure that you fully submit your classes and that the classes accurately are the same on your transcript and your self-reported application. Okay. Let's see. In one webinar, I heard not to show score were not required. So for test optional, is it okay to proactively show? In one webinar, I heard not to show score were not required. So for test optional, yes, it is okay to show, as I mentioned, that was the whole thing here. It's okay to show your SAT score if you are above 50% of the range. Okay. So that's really, really important. That's the whole gist of my, so especially if you're 75%, then you're very, very competitive. And the one thing with test optional and the SAT, as I mentioned, is SATs can definitely offset lower grades. Okay. So if you have lower grades in your classes, and if you have a high SAT, that can give you a little bit of boost to kind of equalize. Okay. Um, how do I? Okay, grades are on transcript, but as Coach mentioned, what if I want to show grade of only certain subjects? How do I? No, no, no. So when I say only show grade, it's the scores that you can show only on certain subjects because you can't hide that in your transcript. So your high school transcript will have every single class you're taking. Let's say you went to community college, your community college is going to show every class that you've taken in their grades. There's no way to selectively leave that out. But for scores, your SAT scores, you have the right to submit whatever SAT score that you want to that school. Okay. I would always recommend do not choose the option when you're taking the SAT to submit scores right away. Only do it when it's asked for. Okay. There's normally an option where for the SAT, you can submit 4 free scores. Don't do that. Okay. What you want to do is you only want to do because you don't know what the score is. And if unfortunately, if you take the SAT and you had a bad day and then it automatically reports to the school has your SAT score. So you don't want to take that option. Okay. Is it safe to research now, or should we wait until closer to the lines in case of policy changes? Oh, no. It's always good to research now. I would never say you want to research now because those ranges are not going to change dramatically. Okay, those ranges are pretty solid. So, the ranges will change, over years of time, but not over 1 year. Okay. How can we find out if particular college is test optional or test blind? So again, as I mentioned, if you saw that there, you can do that by the tools here. So for example, um, fairtest.org. This is the test optional policy checker. Okay, so you can go to fairtest.org, put in the school, and they will tell you exactly what schools are test optional. Okay. There are very few schools that are test blind. Again, the most prominent one is the UCs. If scores are above even 75 percentile, is it recommended to submit an test optional school? Yes, absolutely, 100%. If you have scores that are above 75 percentile, above the 75 percentile in the range, submit it. Okay. It will not hurt you. Will it hurt the chances based on the college assumption that students might be overqualified? Whoa, no, no, submit it. If you absolutely submit it. Okay. Overqualified who is unlikely to join. No, no, I would say is when you're talking about schools that, again, normally, we're thinking about schools that are above and beyond, that are very, very competitive. You want to submit it. Okay, so for year over year, it should be showing all subject, even if some subject fell some from B to A, but others improved. Yes, that's correct. So showing year over year, they will definitely look at that, and that is something that you can't avoid. There's no way to avoid it because they're going to ask for your final transcript. Do you think that test scores are inflated right now for test optional schools? Do you think that test scores are inflated right now for test optional schools? So I'm gonna try to interpret what you mean by that. If you say inflated, do you mean that the schools are reporting inflated scores? Which, again, frankly, I don't think that they do that because that's actually, they can't do that. They have, because they are governed to make sure that they're putting out their, accurate scores. So now, mind you, again, the schools, a lot of times, what I actually see is where the scores are possibly maybe a little bit underinflated just because they don't want to discourage, okay, students. But the scores that I've seen and what I've heard and in attending national conferences with these schools is that there is not an overinflation of the schools, um, not just higher than they would be if everyone submitted. So again, I don't believe that that is the case. Okay. Okay, so let me see if there's anything in the questions Q&A section here. Okay, so middle 50%, example 25% to 75%, or middle 50, like 50 is average and you should be at 50. Yes. So if you look at the range, whatever's in the middle, okay, whatever's in the middle of that range, and then you go higher. Okay, so that's what that means. Should you submit AP of 3? Depends. If you're at the UCs, again, as I mentioned, go ahead and submit it. If you're in private schools, only fours and fives. If test optional, okay, let me read these here. So if test optional, will getting school recognition award, college board, and rural award, where you need to be top 10%, will that help? Sorry, if test optional will get school recognition award and rural award, where you need to be top 10% PSAT, will that help? I'm a little bit confused. I don't know what the question is asking here, but if you're asking about the PSAT, first of all, the PSAT is different, but the SAT, of course, as you know, the PSAT is like a prepper. But the key thing with the PSAT is the key PSAT is that the students that take it in October, all juniors, or most of the juniors take it in October, and what that allows is for the National Merit Scholar organization to be able to determine if they're a National Merit Scholar, and with that, National Merit Scholar is quite a recognized scholarship program. And, normally, again, there's a certain percentage that you have to be above for National Merit Scholar. Typically, it's between the range of 1490 to 1520. 1520 is the highest score for PSATs. And then you go into rounds of interviews and applications or so. Okay, when a school says they are test optional, don't they accept more students with test scores, those without? So again, it doesn't mean, again, there is not, and I've seen this, uh, they haven't really necessarily reported those students that have submitted, and the reason why is because that would sway students in not applying because maybe they're accepting more. But again, remember they said the unwritten rule or the is that, a lot of times you'll see is that those students who have submitted significant test scores normally will have a better chance. Do you think the ranges? Okay, so then the same question. Do you think the ranges are inflated? Okay. All right. With that said, thank you so much for all the amazing questions. You guys are incredible. I'm so extremely happy with the questions and the interaction. Thank you so much for joining me on this particular day for training. I hope that you got a lot out of it. Again, if you want to, get a free assessment, then please go ahead and put in BOOK in and text it to us at 949-775-0865. Have a wonderful evening. I'm so glad that you were with me. I know that you can choose to spend time with your family, your friends, or do some other interesting things, but you spend time with me. So thank you so much for doing so. I greatly, greatly appreciate it. And again, I'm here every Tuesday at 6 o'clock. So please join me for my next training. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll talk to you later. Take it easy. Bye bye.